Donald Boudreaux, who's a professor of economics at George Mason University, where he served as chair of the department for several years, and he's also been president of the Foundation for Economic Education. He writes in a variety of topics, law and economics, international trade. You may know him from Cafe Hayek, where he is one of the two bloggers there. He posts quite a bit. He is a master of the art, the rare art nowadays, of letters to the editor. And he has compiled a bunch of them into his most recent book, Hypocrites and Halfwits. Tonight he's going to talk to us about a famous MTSU alumnus, James M. Buchanan.
It's an honor to be here. First, I should tell you that that sheet was passed out, the correct answers are 5. I'm just teasing. The correct answer is whatever you think it is. But I just thought I would suggest. It's a real honor, an unusual honor, for me to deliver this talk tonight. Jim Buchanan was my colleague for many years at George Mason. I began on the faculty at George Mason. It was my first job in 1985, which was just 2 years after Jim Buchanan had moved his public choice center from Virginia Tech to Fairfax and George Mason University. And that was a move that put my university on the map. Jim won the Nobel Prize in 1986, and that further put it on the map. And to this day, to the very end, Jim died this past January, sad to say, at the ripe old age of 93. He was active to the very end. And there's a Buchanan House on the George Mason faculty. I'm going to spend much of my talk today giving you an overview of public choice, which is what the research program that Jim Buchanan founded offers to our understanding of politics. I call this the greatest hits of public choice. But I want to say a few words about Jim Buchanan, the man. As Mike said, he was a graduate, a proud graduate of Middle Tennessee. Back then it was Middle Tennessee State Teachers College. Buchanan was born in 1919, so you get an idea of when he was in school. He was very proud of his rural Tennessee heritage. And it was an event early on in his life that stuck with him and I think influenced to the very end Buchanan's attitude toward politics and government. As I said, he was born in 1919, so he was of age to serve in World War II. He was in the Navy. And as a young ensign in the Navy, I've heard him tell the story many times, and he would always tell it, even as an old man, with energy and anger. So he said, well, I can't do a good Buchanan accent. He talked like this, very, very deep Southern accent. On the cover of his autobiography, Better Than Plowing, is a picture of Buchanan, and he's sitting in a rocking chair on his farmhouse near Blacksburg, Virginia. And he's wearing overalls. He looks like a poster boy for, some welfare program. You wouldn't think he was this, Nobel Prize winning economist who was fluent in 4 different languages, and was great. I think truly one of the greatest economists and even philosophers of the past 2 centuries. Certainly one of the greatest thinkers that America has ever turned out. So you should be very proud that you will be an alumnus of the same school for which he was proudly an alumnus. Anyway, he tells a story in his autobiography. I've heard him tell it in person many times. That he was assigned as a young ensign in the Navy to a certain group. And the groups were split alphabetically into 2 parts, the A's through the M's or N's, whatever it was, and then the N's through the Z's. And some Navy leader appointed a group leader for each group. And for the A's through N's, because Buchanan was in the A's through N's, his last name began with a B. And for some reason, whoever was choosing these leaders didn't think there was anyone fit in the A's through N's to be a group leader. So they went to the N's through Z group to choose a leader for the A through N group. And the person they had the unfortunate luck to find in this group, the latter group, was someone whose last name was Rockefeller. And so they appointed Rockefeller to be the group leader in the group that Buchanan was in. Buchanan was furious. The idea that he or some of his other colleagues were not sufficient to govern themselves and had to be governed by someone with an elite-sounding name chosen from another group, chosen from outside and put into his group, had a huge effect on him. And I tell that story because much of what I will relate to you as the greatest hits of public choice, you can see the roots of that in this story. I'm not a psychologist or psychoanalyst. I don't want to go too far in speculating how much this one life event played in the development of Jim Buchanan's intellectual history. But he told the story quite frequently. And again, even in his 90s, you could see the fury rising from his. You want to say, Jim, let it go. It happened back in the 40s, right? Right? You know, this is the 21st century. You know, well, they appointed that Rockefeller boy. Buchanan did come from a rural Tennessee background, although not quite as rustic as you might think. His grandfather was governor of Tennessee on the Populist Party ticket back in the 1890s. But he always retained, Buchanan did, he always retained the sort of hardy, rural values of someone who worked hard, woke up early, led a life of sobriety. Not that he didn't indulge a little bit, but he was a hard worker, and you could see it in the prodigious output that his life's output. It would fill up this room many times. He wrote constantly. He's a very intimidating guy, in a way. Before I get to my formal presentation, I'm going to share a few stories. First time I met Buchanan, I first encountered his work when I was your age, as an undergraduate. I had one of my professors say, "You want to read this guy, James Buchanan?" And I'm saying, I didn't realize that the 15th president of the United States was an economist. You know? And, oh, it's a different James Buchanan. It only took me a couple of months to. Now, when someone says James Buchanan, I never think of the president. I think of Jim Buchanan, the economist. And so I was reading Jim Buchanan as an undergraduate and immediately became enamored of his work. He had a huge impact on the way I think about the world and the way I do economics. By the time I first met him when I was in graduate school, I was in awe of him. He was this great scholar. I first met him in 1981. I kind of saw him at a distance, and there's Jim Buchanan. At the time, we didn't even shake hands. The next time I actually was around him, I was a graduate student in Auburn, and I was assigned to pick him up at the Atlanta airport. He was flying in from Fairfax, Virginia, to give some talks at Auburn. And so a couple of graduate student buddies and we drove from Auburn to Atlanta and met Buchanan at the airport. He was very friendly, I remember feeling really proud. I have Jim Buchanan in my car. I got to spend 2 hours with him. He was talking about his days at the University of Chicago back in the late 1940s. He was telling me the story about the Rockefeller kid appointed to head his group. It was, that's when I first heard it from him. The next day, I was assigned to drive him back. I was really pleased to do it. So I picked Buchanan up early. Fortunately, I had a friend of mine with me, Mark Thornton. So we were at Buchanan's hotel, and I'm in my car. I was a graduate student, I had much money, so I had this old Toyota. And it's about a 2-hour drive from Auburn to Atlanta. I'm about 10 minutes out of Auburn, and my car starts going kaplooey. It just smoke starts coming from the hood. And I look over Buchanan, and I can see he's not happy, right? Because he might miss his flight. And so fortunately, I had this friend with me, so we quickly drove back to Auburn, got in my friend's car, and we made it to the airport on time. But for the first hour or so, when it wasn't clear if we'd make it on time, Buchanan's sitting in the car, and he's not happy. I won't make it. But by the time we got to the airport, he said, well, thank you boys for driving me to the Atlanta airport. Come up to George Mason and visit us sometime. I said, will do. The next time I met Buchanan, it was one of the most intimidating days of my life. I really wanted this job at George Mason University. I was just coming out of graduate school. This is 1985. And I was presenting, when you give a talk to get your first job in economics, you give a job talk, and you talk about your dissertation. And in my dissertation, part of it was on the work of a man named Frank Knight. And Frank Knight was Jim Buchanan's major professor, major influence at the University of Chicago. Jim Buchanan greatly admired Knight, wrote very admiringly of Knight till almost to the day Buchanan died. Buchanan wore a little mustache that he said he wears it because that's the kind of mustache Frank Knight wore. So he really admired Frank Knight. And so I'm thinking, wow, I get to give a job talk, because I like Frank Knight's work. So I'm thinking, boy, this is great. I'm giving a job talk on Frank Knight. Buchanan will be there. The job is mine. So I get to George Mason, and I'm nervous. I'm a young guy. And I'm standing in front of the room, and there's Buchanan. He's sitting right up front, like where you are. And he's stretching out his legs, and I'm giving my talk. And I look at him, and he's asleep. I'm not 2 minutes into my talk, and I put Jim Buchanan to sleep. And I remember, I just felt perspiration. I don't want to get too personal, and I'm thinking, I just got to get through this talk, get back. I'll get another job somewhere else. I'm not getting a job here. And I gave him a talk, and I was kind of in a daze. So there's a Q&A period, and people asking questions. And Buchanan's hand shoots up. Oh, yeah, Professor. And he asks the question as if he heard my talk. So I don't know if he was asleep. I don't know what it was. But Jim Buchanan slept through my job talk, and he asked the most, and I couldn't answer. It was this deep, penetrating question. So I start perspiring even more. I got the job. Somehow. I think despite my putting Buchanan to sleep, I don't think he was all that impressed with my talk. But over the years, we grew to become closer acquaintances, and I wouldn't say friends, but closer acquaintances. And as I said, I really admired Buchanan a great deal. And when I heard that he died this past January 9th, it was a real blow, even though he was 93. So it's never, it's a huge surprise or a shocking tragedy. It was still this amazingly important intellectual figure, not only for me personally, but for my institution, George Mason University, and for economics of a sort that I admire a great deal. It was a passing that we're still trying to get over at George Mason. So anyway, Buchanan founds this school of thought called public choice, and I just want to introduce you to some of its greatest hits. By no means is this a full survey of public choice or of Buchanan's work in full. If I have a few minutes at the end, I'll say some words about some topics that Buchanan worked on outside of public choice. But given that this is the most important topic, the most important thing that he worked on, I thought it was appropriate for me to share with you here tonight, is my way of honoring Jim, my understanding of public. Oh, there is another reason why I gave this. I almost forgot. Jim saw years ago, he saw an earlier version of this talk, a much earlier version, I think less polished than this. It was long before PowerPoint. Can't remember the occasion. I was giving a talk to some students, and Jim Buchanan was in the audience. And actually, I remember thinking, I hope he doesn't fall asleep again, right? But this time he stayed awake, and this is me bragging, but I have to brag because I don't get a chance to brag. I don't have that much to brag about, but this I can brag about. So after the talk, Buchanan comes up to me and says, well, Don, I really like, he named some part of it. I like that part of your talk. I wonder if you'll let me use it. Please, use it. Yeah. Oh, why Jim Buchanan wants to use part of my talk. I'll tell you when we get to that part. I want you to know, right? Jim Buchanan gave me, he liked the way I did it. So Buchanan graduates from Middle Tennessee State College, goes off to study at the University of Chicago, taught for a little while at Florida State, did most of his work in the state of Virginia, first at the University of Virginia, then for a few years at Virginia Tech, for most of his career at the single biggest chunk of his career at my institution, George Mason University. So toward the end of his life, Buchanan stopped really using the term public choice, and he would call it Virginia political economy. But most people call it public choice, and so I will continue to call it that. Another name we have for it is politics without romance. That comes from a 1979 article that Jim wrote. He said, I want to explain what public choice is. It's politics without romance. Keep in mind, when Jim started writing in the 1950s, this is immediately after the United States defeats the Nazis and the Japanese. It's a time when the United States is entering a Cold War with a totalitarian dictatorship behind the Iron Curtain. Democracy's riding high. And Buchanan, to give you fair warning, Buchanan was always a fan of democracy. But he understood that at that time, people were making claims about democracy that were simply over the top. And Buchanan, the way to understand his work is to understand that he wanted to look at the world realistically. There's a lot to admire about democracy. He believed that to the day he died. I believe it. But some things that were claimed about it were simply not true. You don't make a case for some social or political institution by overstating the case. He said, look, democracy's got a lot of good qualities, but some things that are claimed for it are not true. Let's be realistic about what democracy can and can't do. Let's look at it not romantically, let's look at it realistically. And that's what his whole public choice enterprise was about. This is a picture of Buchanan. It was taken a few days after he won the Nobel Prize in 1986. It was taken at his office in Fairfax, Virginia. So he's a fellow alumnus of you. This was a few years after he graduated from here. He did his work most famously with his longtime colleague Gordon Tullock, Gordon is still alive, although Gordon is retired. And mostly, I'm proud to say, at my university, George Mason. Jim admired greatly the American founding and the constitutional document that was written in 1787. And he would always say, he said, well, really all Gordon and I did was to take the wisdom of James Madison and America's constitutional founders and formalize it, put it in sort of modern scholarly language and make it clear to modern scholars what was going on. The founders of the American Republic certainly endorsed democracy. They clearly did not like monarchy. They just fought a successful revolution against a monarch. However, they didn't trust it completely. If they did, they would have written a very short constitution. Let's have a House of Representatives and it can do whatever it wants. We don't need any constitutional restrictions. We don't need any separations of powers, checks and balances. Buchanan admired that sort of realistic understanding of what politics should be, of what how democratic politics should be organized. And so he admired the American Constitution. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip through some quotations I have from James Madison. Let's start off with this aspect of public choice. Voting isn't sufficient. Necessary, but it's not sufficient to guarantee that a government will do what is best for the society. It's sort of a naive version of democracy. That's what we think. Well, as long as people can vote and elections aren't rigged, then things will work out. Buchanan said, no, not quite. And the first part of this, what I'm going to do now, is take a little more time than what I'm going to do toward the end. So this first part is the more involved part. I'm going to need some volunteers. Here's an example of a simple what's called a collective action problem. The names I have here, Jim Buchanan, Gordon Tullock, and Jim's longtime faithful secretary, Betty Tillman. So Jim, Gordon, and Betty, these are sort of like three big names in public choice. And let's say they're going to a restaurant, and the restaurant has three options on the menu: apples, bananas, and cantaloupe. Now, in the real world, if Jim, Gordon, and Betty go to a restaurant, they have preferences. The way I have it up here, Jim prefers apples to bananas, and he prefers bananas to cantaloupe. So the higher you go, the higher your preference. Gordon prefers cantaloupe to apples, apples to bananas. Betty prefers bananas to cantaloupe and cantaloupe to apples. In other words, Jim's first choice is apples, Gordon's first choice is cantaloupe, Betty's first choice is bananas. So how do we order in a restaurant today? The waiter or waitress comes by and says, Jim, what will you have? He says, well, I'll have apples. Gordon, what will you have? I'll have cantaloupe. Betty, what do you have? I'll have bananas. Right? That's easy, right? So, and everything works out fine. But let's say we don't want to do it in that individualistic way. Let's say for whatever reason we want to do it democratically. We're going to vote on what we three together want. What is the will of we three, the people, right? And that's what democracy is about. Right? We're going to vote, not just do it individually. Immediately, so let's have a vote. And so you see the problem. In this case, we get no majority winner. We get 1/3 of the vote for apples, 1/3 of the vote for cantaloupe, 1/3 of the vote for bananas. What are we going to do? Jim realized, it wasn't Jim in this case, a lot of people who thought about the way you carry out voting, says we need some way always in democratic procedures to reduce the decision-making process so that you have only two choices effectively at the end. So one will get a majority and one will get a minority and lose. There are many, many different ways to do this. One of the most common ways, the way that's used in most procedures, in most parliaments, in most congresses and governments, is something called pairwise voting. If you have more than two choices, three or more choices, what you do is you take two choices and you have a vote on them, and the loser goes away. You take the winner, you put it up against another choice. And you do that until you have only one winner standing. So let's conduct a vote. So play along with me. So we have a vote down here, apples versus bananas. So if you look up here, Jim votes for apples because he prefers apples to bananas. Gordon votes for apples because he prefers apples to bananas. Betty votes for bananas, but she loses because there are two votes for apples, one vote for bananas, so bananas is out. So now we take the winner, apples, we put it up against cantaloupe. That's the only other option in my simple example. Apples versus cantaloupe. Jim votes for apples. Gordon votes for cantaloupe. It's his first choice. Betty votes for cantaloupe because she prefers cantaloupe to apples. 2 votes for cantaloupe, 1 vote for apples. Apples loses. Cantaloupe is the winner because there's no other choice that we have here. So we call the waiter or waitress, we're having cantaloupe. That's the will of the people as it's interpreted. Right? But what people realized early on, Jim Buchanan and others, is that that's kind of an arbitrary outcome. Suppose we had started the voting somewhere else. Suppose we'd started the voting not with apples versus bananas, as I just arbitrarily did. Suppose we started with cantaloupe versus bananas. Jim votes for bananas, Gordon votes for cantaloupe, Betty votes for bananas, cantaloupe loses, bananas win. Then we have bananas versus apples, apples wins. Or we could start with apples versus cantaloupe and get bananas to win. In the interest of time, I don't want to be tedious and go through this again, but what I'm showing you here is a very famous example of, I'll give it a name in a moment. I don't want to name it yet. A very famous example of, sometimes called a voting paradox. And the paradox is the following, that when you have more than 2 choices, and life is always like that, we almost always have more than 2 choices. When you have more than 2 choices, the outcome of any democratic procedure, I don't care which one you use, right, will always have a significant degree of arbitrariness about it. The outcome will always depend not only on what the voters want, the voters' preferences, but it will depend also to a large degree upon the pure mechanics of how the vote is conducted, how the vote is arranged. See, we like to think of democracy, when it's done well, as finding what the voters' preferences are. What do the voters want? We may agree or disagree with those preferences, but democracy, when done well, should reveal what the voters want and enforce that. And one of the things public choice shows is it doesn't really work that way. Voters' preferences matter, but the outcome of any election will always have in it some effect of the way the vote is conducted, whether in this example the voting starts with apples versus bananas or starts with cantaloupe versus bananas or some other place. You can't get rid of that arbitrariness. So it's a mistake, shows public choice theorists. It's a mistake to credit majoritarian democracy as revealing the will of the people. It doesn't quite do that. We reach an outcome, but that outcome always has some arbitrariness in it. Let me, at the risk of sounding defensive, this is not a slam against majoritarian democracy. It doesn't work maybe ideally in the same way that you learn when you were a junior in high school. Right? But it's not as ideal as you might like to think. It's got these imperfections mixed in with it. In a world in which you're an adult and you look at the world without romance, you look at it realistically, you can deal with imperfections. It doesn't bother you that much, but it's important to understand that these imperfections exist. I'm going to skip some of this in the interest of time. Another fact that public choice discovers is that one of the about voting is that one of the things that voting reveals is the order of preferences. So here I've changed the order of preferences a little bit. Jim, Gordon, and Betty. Jim, as before, prefers apples to bananas and bananas to cantaloupe. Gordon now also prefers apples to bananas and bananas to cantaloupe. Betty prefers cantaloupe to bananas, bananas to apples. And so if we have a vote, in this example, apples will always win, no matter where the voting starts. If you've had public choice economics before, you understand that in this case, apples is something called a Condorcet winner. If you haven't had public choice, then look it up. Right. Condorcet was a French mathematician who was a friend of Jefferson when Jefferson was in France in the 1780s, just FYI. But here's another aspect of an imperfection or a feature of democracy that's often overlooked by people who maybe think of it too ideally. When you go into a voting booth and you vote for candidate A over candidate B, that says that you prefer candidate A over candidate B. What it doesn't say is by how much you prefer candidate A over candidate B. In other words, voting, democratic voting, reveals the order of our preferences. I prefer apples to bananas, bananas to cantaloupe. It does not reveal the intensity of our preferences. But intensity of preferences is real too. Some things you like better than others. Some things you really, really like. Right? Like I really, really like wine, for example. Right? I don't know why I prompted to say that, but I do. I realize there's some things I hate. Right? And I'm sure it's the same for you. So in this case, suppose it's the case that Jim just prefers apples over bananas by $1. I'm just using these numbers just to give you a sense of the intensity of preferences. Jim may prefer apples over bananas just by $1. Not a lot. Gordon too, by $1. But suppose Betty, she prefers cantaloupe over bananas by $10 and bananas over apples by $25. So she prefers cantaloupe over apples by $35. She hates apples. She belongs to the anti-apple religion, right? Or maybe she has an allergy to apples. If she eats an apple, she dies, right? Well, in some sense, don't you want voting to reveal that? You want voting to tell us not only what order people prefer things, not only that Betty prefers cantaloupe to apples, but how much. And one of the things that Jim Buchanan and other public choice scholars point out in their work is that voting doesn't do that. It just registers what we prefer over other things, but not by how much we prefer something over another. Again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't use democracy by any means, but it is a realistic feature of democracy that means that it's not perfect, it's not ideal, it's an imperfection in democracy we just have to deal with. One other aspect on this voting thing, and then I'll move on to some other topics. This is another way to show the same thing. I come from Louisiana. I was born and raised in Louisiana. I don't know how many other states use the kind of system that Louisiana uses to choose governors. I know many others do. It's called a general election runoff election system. Remember I said earlier on that one of the things public choice scholars realized from early on is that for democracy to work, you have to have some method of winnowing down many choices to two. Because only if you have two choices can you get a clear majority. Otherwise, you don't get a clear majority in most cases. So in Louisiana, when we have gubernatorial races, we typically at the beginning have several candidates, maybe 4 candidates. And the rules are this. In the general election, All 4 candidates will go up against one another. If one gets a majority, well, that person becomes governor. But that doesn't happen often because you got many candidates. So the rule is you take the person who gets the greatest percentage of votes, and then the person who gets the second greatest percentage of votes, and you put them against one another in a runoff election. And then one of them will win. So here we have an election situation in which we have 4 candidates, candidates A, B, C, and D. You can give them names if you want. Al, Bob, Carl, and Diane. Right? And we have 10 voters, cleverly marked 1 through 10. Right? And here are their preferences. The first 4 voters prefer candidate A to candidate D to candidate C, and candidate B is their least favorite. And you can see what the preferences are for the other voters. So let's have, in the general election, a vote. Well, candidate A gets 40% of the vote. He gets the votes of voters 1 through 4. Candidate B gets 30% of the votes, voters 5, 6, and 7. Candidate C only gets 20%, voters 8, 9. Candidate D is a loser. He only gets 10% of the vote, right? So candidate A got the most votes, candidate B the second most votes, C and D got the least amounts of votes, so C and D are gone. They're out. And we have a runoff election in which we put candidate A against candidate B. Kind of seems fair, right? So we put candidate A against candidate B. Remember, C and D are gone, right? So you have to if you look at it, you'll see I'm telling the truth. But if you don't, you can trust me because I have a PhD, right? If candidate, now we just have candidate A versus candidate B. Well, voters 1 through 4 vote for candidate A because they prefer candidate A. Voters 5, 6, and 7 vote for candidate B. They prefer candidate B. Voter 8 votes for candidate B. So now they're tied, 40% for A, 40% for B. Voter 9 votes for B, 50% for B. 10 votes for B, 60% vote for B, 40% for A. B is the governor. Got the second most votes in the general election, got the majority of votes in the runoff election. B gets sworn in as governor of the state. I do solemnly swear, blah, blah, blah. Right? But look at this. Suppose we take candidate B, the guy or woman who wins the election, and we put B up against that real loser candidate, candidate D, who got a tiny percentage, the least amount in the general election. Suppose we put candidate B up against candidate D. So if we just do that, like for kicks, well, voters 1 through 4 prefer candidate D to candidate B. Voters 5, 6, and 7 prefer B. Voter 8 prefers D to B. Voter 9 prefers B to D. Voter 10 prefers D to B. Voter D would beat candidate D would beat candidate B in an election. The guy who got the least amount of votes in the general election, in this example, would beat the guy who wins the runoff election. Now, I constructed this example to get that result, but it's child's play to do that. This is one of the important findings of public choice. And again, that important finding is the outcome of any election process. Any election process has a huge amount of arbitrariness in it. It is unavoidable. It's, in a way, it's kind of sobering, but it is a fact. And it doesn't mean that majority rule voting is bad. In fact, it's not bad. It's very desirable. I have a couple of, just 3. We can list more. It provides for regular changes of power holders. That's a good thing. Prevents government from doing very unpopular things. It keeps government power in the hands of the voters at the end of the day. When governments change hands, it's done by election and not by armed rebellion. Those are good things. I'm not making an argument. Jim Buchanan did not make an argument against democratic voting, but he did say, look, we have to look at it realistically. It's not as ideal as we might think. There is no clear will of the people. I put the exclamation point there because this should, for me when I first, it was like a wow. This is incredible. This is important stuff. It's called Arrow's impossibility theorem. This is a picture of Kenneth Arrow, who's another founder of public choice. And I think he looked kind of surprised because he was about the same age as Buchanan when he set out to to do his work in this, he was kind of surprised by the result. And what he proved is what I just asserted to you, that any collective decision-making procedure, any majoritarian voting will have some arbitrariness in it. It's unavoidable. Again, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be used, but that arbitrariness is, you can't get rid of it. It's always there. Here are some additional realities of democratic politics as explained by Jim Buchanan and his colleagues over the years. Perhaps most famous is the special interest group effect. This is a beet farmer in Oregon. I don't know the gentleman's name. We can call him Mr. Beet. He's smiling because, well, he's making a lot of money off of something called the special interest group effect. The American sugarcane farmers in South Louisiana and Florida have a lot of power, political power. And for nearly 80 years now, they have persuaded Uncle Sam to severely restrict imports into America of foreign cane sugar, which raises the price of sugar and sweetener in America. If you're a beet farmer in Oregon, you like that because you can make sugar out of beets. And so what does it do to the demand for your product? It goes up. What does that do to your income? It goes up. You like the sugar program. How many of you have heard of the U.S. sugar program, honestly? None of you have heard of the U.S. That works to my advantage in a moment. You'll see why. Hear of it or not, I can tell you with certainty that you pay every year, for every year you live in America, you pay between $10 and $20 more every year for sugar than you would have to pay if it weren't for the U.S. sugar program. That's not a huge amount of money, but it's some amount of money. And when you add that $10 or $20 that you pay to the $10 and $20 that your brother pays and your sister pays and your mother pays and your girlfriend pays and your grandparents pay and your teacher pays and your neighbors pay, you have 300-something million Americans, it adds up. That's a lot of extra money. So you pay that. Every American pays slightly higher prices for sugar. But who gets the benefits? It's concentrated in sugar farmers. This guy gets a lot of those benefits. His income is higher every year, surely at least by tens of thousands of dollars, in some cases by hundreds of thousands of dollars. There are sugar farmers in Florida and South Louisiana whose incomes are made higher every year by millions of dollars because of the U.S. sugar program. Now, I just told you about the U.S. sugar program. My hope is that you aren't happy with it. I want you to think, because that's what I think, you know, why should I pay more money for sugar every year just to make this guy richer? But let's say you do feel, I don't know if you do feel that way. Let's say you do feel that way. What are you going to do about it? Well, you live here in Middle Tennessee. That's why it's called Middle Tennessee State University. You live here in Middle Tennessee. You don't live near Washington. So you might be angry. You go home and you write an email to your congressman. Dear Congressman, I was just told by a very, very good college professor, right, that I'm paying more money for sugar. Don't stop that program. Right? You think it's going to have much of an effect on the congressman? Nah, probably not. You get a nice letter. Thank you for your consideration. I'll keep your thoughts in mind next time on the floor of the House/Senate, whatever I'm in. Now, suppose this guy opens a paper in the morning and he discovers that Congress is thinking about abolishing your sugar program. Right? You think he's just going to write an email to his congressman? Dear Congressman, please don't do that because I'll lose $100,000 worth of income. No, he's going to take huge steps. See, it's only costing you between $10 and $20 a year. It's not a lot of money. You're not going to spend much more than that to fight the sugar program. You may hate it in your bones now that I've told you about it. You're not going to spend $100 to save 10 or 20, right? Because you have other things to do with your life. He's going to spend up to, let's say he's making an extra $100,000 a year, which is not unreasonable. He's going to spend up to $100,000 a year to make sure Congress keeps that program. Now, he personally is probably not going to go to Washington. He's a beet farmer. He's going to hire this guy. This is a lobbyist. And there's a street in Washington called K Street. Another name for it is Gucci Gulch, which is kind of fancy name for it. That's the street where most lobbyists work. Lobbyists are people who, they used to hang outside of the lobby of the Capitol building to persuade congressmen to pass this law, pass that piece of legislation. Sugar farmers understand that the sugar program is very valuable to them. And to keep that program going, they're willing to pitch in a lot of money every year to hire experts who are very good at talking to politicians in order to persuade politicians to do their bidding. And that's what lobbyists do. So Mr. Beet Farmer and all the sugar farmers in Florida and South Louisiana, they pitch in, and there's a trade association in Washington, I forget its exact name, the U.S. Sugar Association, or Sugar Trade Association, something like that. And they have full-time staff of lawyers and assistants who know people in Congress, and they're chumming with people in Congress. They take congressmen to dinner and they tell Congress how important the sugar program is. See, the issue here is called a special interest group effect because the benefits of the sugar program are concentrated on a relatively small number of people, sugar farmers. The cost of the program, which on the whole are much larger than the benefits, but the costs are spread out, and they're spread out so widely that those of us who pay the cost don't feel it enough. So we don't protest it enough. And when you have that concentration of benefits and the spreading out of costs, programs can get created and last, persist over time, even though they might not actually promote the public interest. I actually don't know a single person who's not a sugar farmer or who works for sugar farmers who thinks that the U.S. sugar program serves the public interest. I can't think of any good reason why Americans should pay 2 to 3 times the world price every year for sugar. But we do, and we do, I think, not because there's any great public case to be made for keeping the price of sugar in America artificially high. We have the program because sugar farmers, the benefits of the program are concentrated on them, and so they have a disproportionate incentive to lobby to keep it, which is at least how public choice theory explains the creation and the maintenance of the sugar program. Now, I just asked you how many of you knew about the sugar program. None of you raised your hand. Maybe you're being shy. Maybe you all know about it. Although I suspect you probably don't. I didn't know about the sugar program until I started studying public choice economics. The theory behind majoritarian democracy is that obviously politicians are beholden to the voters. They are our servants. We tell them what to do by voting them in office and by voting them out if they don't. For it to work, voters have to be knowledgeable. They have to know what's going on. You don't know about the sugar program. And I'm pretty sure that's not the only thing you don't know about. One of the most famous findings of public choice economics is that voters are what's called rationally ignorant. It sounds kind of bizarre. Ignorance is not supposed to be rational. But it's perfectly true. Your time is scarce. You, like everybody else, have only 24 hours in your day. You have lots of things to do. Study, be with friends, sleep, a bunch of things to do. Things that, and you can control. You know, the more time you study, the better your chances are of passing exams and getting better grades. The more time you spend with your friends, the better your chances are of maintaining good relationships with your friends. But what happens when you spend more time pondering public policy issues? You go to the poll, you cast a vote. You don't have as much personal effect on the outcome of public policy as you have in your private life when you spend more time studying or being with friends. So as a result, public choice theorists say that voters are rationally ignorant. Without looking up, I want you to tell me how many light bulbs are in the ceiling of this room. How many of you have counted how many light bulbs are in the ceiling of this room? It's really easy. I mean, this, a 2-year-old can do it, right? 1, 2, 3, not many, couple, maybe a dozen, right? Now, that's a piece of knowledge. It's an easily gotten piece of knowledge, and yet none of you have that knowledge. Why don't you have that knowledge? Because it's absolutely worthless, right? Even though the cost of getting that knowledge in this case is really slim, you could have come in here 2 seconds earlier. It's worthless. Now, suppose I tell you, I'm not really doing this, but suppose I said, I will give $50 to everyone who gives me the correct answer to the question, how many light bulbs are in the ceiling of this room? Then what would you do? You'd count, yeah. Because then the knowledge has a payoff to you. What the theory of rational ignorance says is that people gather knowledge only if it's valuable to them. And I think that makes sense. Our time is scarce. Our mental capacity is scarce. Einstein's mental capacity Jim Buchanan's mental capacity was scarce, for heaven's sake. Even the most brilliant people's mental capacity is scarce. We don't have time to learn everything there is to learn. So the things we choose to gain knowledge on are things that we can personally affect through our actions. We don't personally affect the outcome of political elections. We have some effect, but it's really tiny. When you vote for the president, you have, 1 in 70 millionth effect on the outcome. It's a really tiny effect. And so the payoff to you of spending a lot of time learning about all the issues in play and all the different theories is so small, you probably don't, if you're a rational voter, you probably don't spend much time learning about all the issues as you would if you, in fact, could determine whether candidate Smith or candidate Jones becomes the next president or the next governor or the next mayor. Voters, public choice theorists say, are rationally ignorant. It's not a bad thing, it's just a reality thing. But because of that, we can't assume, note carefully how I'm saying it, because of rational ignorance, we cannot simply assume that the outcome of democratic elections reflects an informed decision by the populace. In a way, radical stuff, but there's a case to be made for it. How many of you plan to go to law school? Anybody? When you go to law school, one thing you learn about is something called the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR for short. This is a picture of part of the Code of Federal Regulations. If you go into a library, of course it's all online now, this is the hard copy. The Code of Federal Regulations is the compilation of all the existing rules promulgated by the U.S. bureaucracies, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Elections Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, on and on, Environmental Protection Agency. Many of them perhaps very, very good and sensible rules. But there are a lot of them. It's all in these, that's just part of it. If you took a tape measure, which I've done, and you go into a library and you measure the amount of library shelf space that the Code of Federal Regulations takes up, anyone want to guess how many feet of library shelf space? 26 feet of library shelf space. That's much more than that. So to be an informed voter, you'd have to read all of that. How many of you have even heard before tonight of the Code of Federal Regulations? The only reason I heard it because I went to law school, right? But that's most of the law that comes out of Washington. Yeah, I'm not commenting on the content of it. We can assume it's all just dandy. But we cannot assume that voters know what's in it. I doubt, in fact, I'm not willing to bet my pension on many things, but I would bet my pension that there's not a single human being alive who has ever read cover to cover every volume of the Code of Federal Regulations. First of all, that person would be the dullest human being ever to live, right? And blind, because it's really tiny print, right, on very thin onion skin paper, mostly. But to be a fully informed voter, you have to know that. So public choice is another realistic thing. So look, let's not be unrealistic about what democracy does. Voters aren't fully informed. They're probably not even adequately informed about what's at stake in elections. There's a lot of confidence and faith and trust that goes into elections, which is one reason why it's not bad to trust the character of candidates. Because you can't trust that you know, and yet your fellow voters know the content of what's in there. One final, I'll end on this and then open it up to questions. And again, I'm just doing the greatest hits of public choice. It's the bundling effect. Suppose you go into a supermarket and you see someone You go into the ordinary, what's soup? They have Kroger here? What supermarkets do you guys have here? What, say what? Kroger Republic. Kroger. So you go into Kroger and you watch someone go through the supermarket, and they have their shopping cart, and they put in paper towels, they put in some pork chops, they put in, I don't know if you can buy beer here in the supermarket. You can in Virginia. Right? Put beer in, and you see them pay, and they don't put in contact lens solution or dog food. Right? And well, you could pretty much conclude that everything in that person's basket is something that person wanted to buy, and things that they didn't put in their basket are things they didn't want to buy that night. That kind of makes sense. But suppose we chose groceries differently than we actually do. Let's say instead you walk into a supermarket and you didn't get to go down the aisles, but there were pre-packaged baskets for you. Let's say there are 3. So here's basket A, basket B, and basket C. And basket A, I mean, they're all covered in plastic, like see-through plexiglass. You can see what's in the basket, but you can't take anything out or put anything in. And all you can do is choose basket A, basket B, or basket C. Right? So you look at basket A. Basket A has dog food. You don't need dog food because you don't have a dog. It doesn't have cat food. You do have a cat. Huh. It's got pork chops. That's good because you want pork chops. It's got paper towels. That's good because you want paper towels. It's got contact lens solution. You don't wear contacts. Well, let me look at basket B. It's got the cat food. That's good. Doesn't have the dog food. That's good. But it's got diapers. You don't have children. Basket C. Doesn't have diapers. That's good. It's got the cat food. That's good. It's got the pork chops. You like that. That's good. But it's got, motor oil. And, you don't need motor oil. So you got to choose. Now, let's say you choose basket A. And someone witnesses you choosing basket A. The best that we can conclude is that you prefer basket A to basket B to basket C. But notice, you chose basket A not because of everything that's in it, but despite the fact that it has some things in it you don't like. Right? You didn't want the dog food, but you got it anyway. And you did want cat food, but you didn't get it because the dog food's in basket A, cat food isn't. Right? Think about, that's how we choose candidates. In a world in which government does a lot, and for better or worse, we live in a world in which government does a lot. A lot of things are at issue. So each candidate for office, be it mayor, governor, president, senator, you name it, is necessarily a bundle of positions on many different issues. Court appointments, the environment, taxes, foreign intervention, abortion, on and on, thousands of issues. And so you're asked to choose candidate Jones over versus candidate Smith versus candidate Williams. So let's say you vote for candidate Jones. Well, we can believe that you prefer candidate Jones to candidate Smith to candidate Williams, but that does not mean, in fact, it almost surely doesn't mean that everything in candidate Jones's bundle of positions you like and prefer to everything in the other 2 candidates' positions. You voted for candidate Jones in spite of the fact that he or she takes positions on issues that you disagree with. You voted against candidate Smith and Williams in spite of the fact that they actually have some positions that you prefer to the positions taken by the candidate for whom you did vote. And so when a candidate wins elections, I'll just use this candidate because he's obvious now, Obama. But if I did this 8 years, I'd say Bush. It doesn't matter. It's not a partisan lecture. Obama wins. He can't know. He cannot know exactly why he won. He can guess. But it's almost surely the case that even a majority of the people who voted for him disagree with his position on many issues. That's a result of what we call the bundling effect. Now, there's no way he knows that, so he naturally assumes, any candidate naturally assumes that, well, I won the election, therefore every one of my positions is a position that at least the majority of people who voted for me favor. And that's almost certainly not true. But there's an information problem. Candidates can't know exactly why they won. They can't know exactly why their opponents lost. They can guess. And that's yet another imperfection in translating the results of voting into public policy. And it's a cause for recognizing that the results of voting do not in any direct and careful way or precise way reflect something that can legitimately be called the will of the people. This is just a very brief introduction to public choice. Jim Buchanan's work, let me assure you, is far deeper, far broader than my talk here. It's far deeper or far broader than any talk I could possibly give. He was a tremendously deep and profound scholar whose work will, I think, live for centuries. I think he's one of the top 3 or 4 economists in history, much less during the 20th century where he did most of his writings. But I hope that my very brief and hopelessly inadequate introduction to public choice gave you at least a sample or a sense of the kind of work that Jim and Gordon Tullock and his other colleagues did. I will end there. Thank you for your very fine attention. And I have time to answer some questions. So, okay.
All right, any questions? I guess I have a question. What was the part of the talk that James Buchanan liked? The bundling effect. He liked yeah, because I hear talk about the bundling effect, and I was giving a talk to something called the Public Choice Outreach Program, and I'm thinking, how can I explain this in a way that makes it appealing to people who don't know public choice yet? And I thought, a grocery basket example. And I remember giving this talk, and there's Buchanan. Remember, the first time I think Buchanan only heard me talk twice. The first time he fell asleep. And this time he's looking at me, and I'm thinking to myself, go, got it. Yeah, and so he liked it. He came up to me after and said, well, Don, I kind of like that. Can I use that? Yeah. So he liked that one. So pardon me for bragging, but heck, I can brag. Yeah, it was the bundling effect part. I didn't make the concept that he liked my example of it. Yes, sir.
To what extent have any of these ideas, sort of permeated, Washington in terms of awareness or changing perspectives on the things you brought up?
You mean permeated the people who are in office in Washington?
Yeah, like in terms of,
That's a 64, well, I guess now we should say $1 trillion question. It's a huge question. I don't know. I actually don't hang around with a lot of politicians. I mean that in a joking way. I don't know many. But this is a guess. And the few I know, this is what I infer from them. They kind of get it. They kind of get it. They understand that there's a famous statement by the German Chancellor Bismarck that there are 2 things you should never actually witness being made: legislation and sausage, right? Because the process of making them is a lot less savory than the final presented outcome. I mean, it looks nice in the presentation, the Wonderful Good Things for America Act, the prosciutto ham sausage, right? But the process of making them is kind of icky. And I think most politicians understand that. But one of the other great insights of public choice is that, look, politicians want to be elected. I understand that. They want to maintain their time in office. And in order to do that, their time perspective only goes really to the next election. And so they want to do and say things in order to win the next election. And if that means trimming on some issues, sort of ignoring other issues, maybe changing their position on other issues, unfortunately, too many politicians are willing to do that. Not all. I think some are more principled than others. In political science, public choice has had a huge influence, certainly compared to what it was like before the 1950s. And economics has had some influence, too. I wish it would have more. Yeah.
The arguments you presented don't really give a strong argument for the individual taking the time to become informed and voting. If the public was made more aware of public choice theory, do you think that would only exacerbate that problem?
Oh, that's a deep question. Actually, Jim Buchanan pondered that. I can't remember the title of, he had an article in which he wondered exactly this. He said, you know, I wonder if in my life's work I've actually made things worse. I don't think he really believed that, but he was honest and philosophically sophisticated enough to understand that. Because if I understand your question right, he said, you know, I'm exposing, I spent my life exposing majoritarian democracy as not being the sort of as wonderful as it's presented to most Americans in public discourse. So maybe an ill consequence of that is people become too cynical, right? That's what you're suggesting. Yeah. Buchanan recognized that as a possibility. I don't recall that he certainly didn't retract. I mean, as a scholar, you say, I just want to find the truth and explain the truth as best as I understand it. But he did understand, and I think he was right to understand, that maybe it did have this negative effect. Maybe it's the case if people do have sort of a mythology about how it works, that mythology can carry them forward and persuade them to do things they otherwise might not do if they fully understand this reality. It's a good question, really deep. You're a Middle Tennessee State University student. See? That's what Buchanan gets it. It's something in the air. Yep.
What would be your worst offender when it comes, like we talked about the, I'm sort of ignorant to that. I mean, I don't really know much about the sugar, quotas or tariffs or whatever. What would be like a very, is that like the worst kind of example of sort of what you're talking about here, or are there more,
there.
Yeah. I resonate more with people than farming.
Well, I mean, tariffs are always the single most obvious example, at least to an economist, of the special interest group effect. It's very difficult to justify tariffs economically. I mean, anybody who studies these things, almost all economists, that's an area which economists have huge consensus on, no matter where they stand in the political spectrum, that tariffs are harmful. Right? So, but we have them. We have a lot of them. How do you explain them? Well, special interest group effect. The people who benefit from tariffs are producer groups, like sugar farmers or tomato growers or steel producers or auto producers. People who pay the costs are consumers as a whole. Consumers are, hundreds of millions of people. And so when those costs are spread out widely and the benefits concentrated, the people on whom the benefits are concentrated naturally have a greater incentive to lobby for the program than the people who pay the cost have an incentive to lobby against it.
I guess I was thinking of, because I've heard of these, I don't know if it's goat herders or there's these special animals or whatever that aren't even domestic to the United States.
Oh, the mohair farmers. I forget the exact details, but I'll give you an example. Well, for some reason I'm stuck in agriculture, but Jim Buchanan was a farm boy, maybe that's why. How many of you have ever heard of, first of all, how many of you eat lettuce? I do too. What a coincidence. If you go back to the Code of Federal Regulations, one day I was flipping through it, just at random. I kind of wanted to see what I'd find at random. How many of you ever heard of the Southwest Texas Lettuce Growers Association? There is such a thing. The Southwest Texas Growers Association, set up by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Do you know what the Southwest Texas Lettuce Growers Association does? It's a cartel of lettuce growers. That's what it does. It's designed to prop up the price of lettuce. Now, who do you think that's for? Right? It's not for you. So, let's prop up the price of lettuce so consumers can pay more. It's to prop up the price of lettuce for lettuce growers. I assume Southwest Texas is a hotbed of lettuce growing. Right? Must be a lot of lettuce growers located in Southwest Texas. Right? And I have no doubt that the income of lettuce growers in Southwest Texas is a lot higher because of the Southwest Texas Lettuce Growers Association than it would be without that association. You pay the price of that. I don't know what it is. Probably on an annual basis, depending on how much lettuce you eat, $3, $4 a year. You don't even notice it. Right? But $3, $4 a year for lettuce, $10, $20 a year for sugar, $40, $50 extra dollars a year for cars that contain steel. Right? It adds up over. But for each of the ones you don't recognize, but those producers do recognize it. I think I wouldn't say a majority, maybe majority, But if you look at what Congress does, much of that is more easily explained if you understand the special interest group effect than if you don't. It's hard to explain on public interest grounds. Wow, Congress passed legislation that keeps the price of sugar high because it's great for America. Maybe. How is that great for America? How is it that we all benefit by paying more for sugar? It's true, you can tell a story. I don't think it's a very compelling story. I think a more compelling story is Congress passed a sugar program because you got a lot of sugar farmers who pay a lot in lobbying to have Congress maintain the sugar program. And the people who pay the cost don't even know about its existence, and if they do, they don't have it in their incentive to take actions against it. Yes, Mike.
Point out that Brian Kaplan actually argues that it's even worse than that, right? Brian argues that
Rationality.
That people actually talk themselves into liking these programs. That farmers are good people, right? So if these programs are helping farmers, then I guess that's a good thing.
Yeah,
right?
that's sort of the next generation in public, which I think is really good. I think it only adds to it. Professor Hammock mentioned my colleague Brian Kaplan is one of the more brilliant younger public choice scholars at George Mason.
So Buchanan, he spent a lot of time critiquing the majoritarian democracy, well, at least describing it, I guess. Do you have any prescriptions on improving on the Madisonian Clysenic model?
Thanks for that question. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but I appreciate it. Buchanan, toward the end of his life, so the last 20 years of his life, devoted his energies, most of his energies, to something called constitutional economics. Buchanan understood very deeply that without good constitutional rules, when people play what he called the ordinary game of politics, too often the results of the game would be bad. You have the special interest group effect dominates, rational ignorance, all these other things cause democracy not to serve the public interest, but to serve too often special interests at the expense of the public interest. And the way out of that, said Buchanan, was to have constitutional rules that constrain government from doing these bad sorts of things and channel it into doing things that are good. And his hope lay in having sort of what he called an all-inclusive constitutional process where we all get together and somehow say, okay, look, what's good for what would be good overall rules for our society? Again, he looked back to the 1787 Constitutional Convention. He admired it a great deal. It largely worked. He thought it was sort of going off the rails a little bit here toward the end of his life. I think Buchanan never succeeded in that personally. I think he was too optimistic about the ability to reform the Constitution. That's what he wanted. I think if it could be done, it would work. But I think it's more difficult than he thought, more difficult to do than he thought it was to do. But he did turn his attention to it. There's a lot of wheel spinning in that part of his work. I don't think he never quite drove home how it would be accomplished. He was very good at describing the problems. Coming up with a prescription to solve them was different. Yes, ma'am.
You said he was in favor of constitutional reform, and a minute ago you said Congress does things because of the lobbying efforts.
Yep.
I'm not sure I believe that. They don't do it because of the lobbying efforts. They do it because they're getting money.
Well, but the lobbying, the two aren't in conflict. I think
No, they're not in conflict with one another, but just the lobbying is not as effective as the campaign contribution.
That's a big discussion, and fortunately for me, we don't have time for it. No,
Reforms that he would have supported might have related to campaign finance.
I can't speak to how he would come down on, because I've never heard him talk about it or write about it. He wrote, I read most of his work. I haven't read it all. Maybe he did write on that. My guess is he would oppose that on the grounds that open competition, as bad as lobbying is, it's better to have competition among lobbyists so they can keep each other at bay. And so my guess is he would have thought that was the better way, that if you constrained campaign financing, that would somehow allow well, that it wouldn't work. But that's the, I'm not sure, I've never heard him comment on that. His one big issue on the Constitution, the one specific thing he did write about a lot, he was in favor of a balanced budget amendment. I remember being with him, just by complete coincidence, on the day in 1995, I believe it was, when there was an attempt to an attempt for Congress to present a balanced budget amendment to the states, and it failed by one vote. And Buchanan was despondent. He worked at such a high level, he actually very seldom bothered with day-to-day politics, and he didn't get that upset by particular political goings-on. He was this real high-level philosopher, but he was so interested in balanced budget that the day it passed, I've never seen him as, again, wasn't his closest friend. It's not like he and I hung out together and knocked down whiskeys every night. But I knew him pretty well toward the end. And he was despondent at the failure of the balanced budget amendment. And I was surprised at how despondent he was. But on the campaign finance issue, I don't know exactly how he'd come. That's a good question. Yep.
So how does we kind of reconcile the idea of having some constitutional reform with the idea that, you want to set up these kind of rules-based systems? It seems like that's something Buchanan was in favor of. Two other economists, Finn Kinlan and Ed Prescott, won a Nobel Prize in 2004 in part for their idea of, sometimes it's better to have rules than let there be discretion. And I mean, it seems like there's instances like last Friday where people were happy to give up the Fourth Amendment. A few months ago, people were more than happy to give up the Second, perhaps. And, there's always an instance where maybe you don't want to allow certain freedoms, but, to what extent would you want to have these reforms, and what would Buchanan think about, having more of a living document or changing the constitutional?
Buchanan was definitely a rules-oriented guy. He emphasized the importance of rules. I think one of his best, he wrote a lot of books. One of his best books is his 1985 book with an economist named Jeff Brennan called The Reason of Rules. And it's one of his shorter books. It's maybe like 150 pages. And it's a really eloquent explanation of the importance of rules. Rules have costs, because sometimes they prevent you in a particular situation from doing what might be best in that situation. But the benefit of following rules over time means that over the long run, we'll be better off. And one of the things that did distress him was the increasing discretion. That's the word used, that's the word he would use. The increasing discretion that was used at every moment in time without any reference to the larger rules by which those pieces of exercise of discretion could be justified. If you take, I'm sure it's true for other disciplines too in the social sciences, but the one I know best is economics. I know you too. And it's not too much to say that you can divide economists into two different camps, right? There are those who understand how a government with a lot of discretion can do good and trust the government with that discretion to do good. There are others who have a much more skeptical view of government. They don't trust the government for whatever reason to do good, so they want the second group, they want that government constrained by rules. They recognize that in some cases might prevent some particular instances of good from being done. But they say the longer run benefit of keeping the government within rules is beneficial. So go back to the story I told about Buchanan and the Rockefeller guy. Buchanan did not trust government in part, or put it this way, part of the distrust that Buchanan had for even the best form of government is that he worried that it would be captured too much by elites. It's not a surprising position for someone who was brought up in a populist family on a rural Tennessee farm in the early part of the 20th century. And he was worried about these elites capturing the government. And if you're an elite capturing the government, you can justify breaking the rules here, breaking the rules there to do what you think is in the best interest. And Buchanan, the rural farm boy from Tennessee, did not trust the Rockefeller rich guy from some East Coast city to do what was best for Buchanan. So he would just prefer rules to keep the power tamped down. That's a long and rambling answer to it's a long-winded way for me to avoid answering your question in any precise way. About out of time. Well, thank you very much. And again, congratulations for being